Have you ever wondered what happens when a millionaire's world collides with desperation?
He thought it was just another business meeting, until a barefoot boy tugged his sleeve and whispered, "Please, my sisters are hungry."
That moment changed the millionaire CEO's life forever.
The day had started like any other for Stephen Carter, CEO of one of the most powerful logistics corporations on the East Coast. His schedule was packed, his phone never stopped vibrating, and his assistant had already reminded him twice that he was late for a shareholders' meeting. As he exited the towering glass office building that bore his name in gold lettering near the entrance, he adjusted the sleeve of his tailored light blue suit and glanced at his reflection in the polished windows. His deep brown eyes looked tired, his perfectly combed hair undisturbed by the slight morning breeze. He expected the usual, a sleek black car pulling up to the curb, a few handshakes from passing employees, and another day consumed by high-stakes decisions. What he didn't expect was a quiet voice at his side.
"Excuse me, my sisters are hungry. Can you help us?"
Stephen turned sharply, more startled by the desperation in the voice than the words themselves. Standing before him was a boy, maybe 7 years old, barefoot and thin, with messy dark blonde hair and large, weary eyes. He was holding the hand of one little girl and had the other tucked behind his leg, shyly peeking out.
The girls looked almost identical, perhaps 4 years old, with tangled curls and oversized second-hand dresses that didn't match but were clearly well worn. All three children looked exhausted, sunburned, and underfed. For a brief moment, Stephen's mind rejected what he saw. This wasn't supposed to happen in front of his building. Not here. Not to him.
He hesitated, looking around for a parent, a guardian, someone. But there was no one, just the children and the wall of busy adults who passed by without a second glance. Stephen knelt, his expensive suit brushing the edge of the pavement, and looked the boy in the eyes.
"What's your name?" he asked.
"Jacob," the boy answered.
"These are my sisters, Lily and Sophia." "And where is your mom or dad?" Stephen asked as gently as he could. Jacob lowered his gaze. "Mom's in the hospital. She's in a coma. And Dad, he left. He didn't want us anymore." Stephen's stomach turned. "Where are you staying? Who's taking care of you?"
The boy hesitated again, then said with a kind of quiet pride, "I take care of them.
We were in a home, but they said they'd separate us. Different families. I couldn't let them split us, so we left." Stephen blinked, trying to process it all.
3 children, homeless, the oldest barely out of kindergarten, surviving on the streets of New York City, all because the system meant to protect them had threatened to tear them apart.
He glanced at Lily and Sophia.
They were standing so still, clinging to each other like baby birds caught in a storm.
He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after hearing that. "You're hungry?" Stephen asked. Jacob nodded silently.
Without a word, Stephen stood and extended his hand.
"Come with me."
He opened the door to his waiting car and ushered the 3 children inside, instructing the driver to head to a nearby cafe. The children sat stiffly, unsure if they were in trouble or dreaming. Stephen called his office and canceled his meeting.
He didn't offer an explanation.
He didn't care what they thought.
Right now, nothing else mattered. At the cafe, Jacob ordered oatmeal for the girls and asked if he could get eggs, too. Stephen told the waiter to bring whatever they wanted. He watched as the girls devoured their food like they hadn't eaten in days. They didn't speak much, but their wide eyes followed Stephen's every move. Jacob was more cautious, his eyes sharp with suspicion, even as he carefully spread jam on a slice of toast for his sister. Stephen had faced mergers, hostile takeovers, government investigations, and billion-dollar negotiations. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. For the child across from him, who had clearly carried more responsibility than any boy ever should, for the way these 3 small strangers had suddenly pulled him into something far more urgent than any business deal. As the girls finished their meal, Stephen leaned forward again. "Do you remember which hospital your mom is in?" Jacob nodded. "Mount Grace. It's far, but I know how to get there." Stephen made a decision.
It was impulsive, maybe even reckless, but he felt it down to his core.
"I'm going to take you there." We're going to see her. And after that, we'll figure things out. You're not alone anymore." Jacob didn't smile. He didn't cry, but he held Stephen's gaze, then gave the smallest, nearly imperceptible nod. It was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. And as they got back into the car, Stephen felt something shift inside him, something deep and immovable. He didn't know these children, but he would protect them because now he couldn't not care. Because the second Jacob looked him in the eyes and asked for help, Stephen Carter's world had changed forever. The ride to Mount Grace Hospital was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty. It was the kind weighed down with thoughts too big for words. Jacob sat next to Stephen in the back seat, his small frame stiff, as if bracing for something he wasn't sure how to face. Lily and Sophia leaned against each other, already drifting into a light sleep, lulled by the hum of the car and the warmth of a full meal for the first time in who knows how long. Stephen looked at them through the rearview mirror, trying to understand how the world had allowed them to fall through the cracks. He had built empires, managed crises worth millions, but now he felt the most urgent thing in his life was figuring out how to keep these kids safe. When they arrived at the hospital, Jacob led the way through the front entrance with a familiarity that broke Stephen's heart. No child should know the layout of a hospital this well. They took the elevator up to the intensive care unit, the air sterile and heavy. Nurses at the station looked up as they approached, eyeing the children with surprise and then glancing at Stephen with suspicion. He explained quickly who he was and why they were there. And after a few questions and a quick check in their system, a young nurse softened and nodded. "She's still in the same room. No changes on her chart this morning," the nurse said quietly. Jacob took Lily and Sophia by the hand and led them into the room. Stephen followed, but stopped short just inside the doorway. There, lying unconscious in the hospital bed, was a woman with pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, and thin tubes running from her arms and nose to machines that beeped steadily. It was obvious she hadn't moved in weeks. The children approached her bed, standing so close their heads nearly touched as they looked down at their mother. "Mama," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling now for the first time. "We're okay. I told you I'd keep them safe." Stephen stood back, the scene cutting into him like nothing ever had. He had known grief in the abstract. He had given speeches about loss, about resilience, about giving back. But this was personal. It was raw, unfiltered reality. A boy talking to his unconscious mother like she could hear him, like just his presence could bring her back. After a while, Stephen stepped outside the room to give them privacy. He paced the hallway slowly, ignoring the ringing of his phone. When the nurse returned, she handed him a folder with some basic information about Sarah Miller, her name, her condition, estimated hospital costs, and contact notes. There were no visitors on file aside from the children, and a social worker who hadn't been able to locate any other relatives. The state had already begun the process of evaluating foster placements. Stephen asked her to pause that process immediately. The nurse looked at him skeptically. "Are you family?" she asked. He hesitated. "No, but I'm staying involved. I won't let them get separated." That evening, Stephen brought the kids back to his apartment. It was a place of quiet luxury, high above the city, designed more for solitude and control than comfort. But as the children stepped inside, their wide eyes scanned the polished floors, the panoramic windows, the gleaming surfaces, and they didn't say a word. They weren't impressed. They were overwhelmed. They stood together, frozen, unsure what to do in a space so unfamiliar. Stephen quickly realized this was not the time for grand gestures. He knelt down beside them and said, "You're safe here, just for now. You can sleep, eat, rest, and tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Lily reached for his hand without a word. Sophia leaned against her brother. That night, Stephen set up a guest room with extra blankets, ordered more clothes and supplies, and made sure each child had something soft and warm to sleep in. They ate toast with jam and drank warm milk. He sat with them as they watched a cartoon on low volume until they could no longer keep their eyes open. After they fell asleep, Stephen stood in the hallway, staring into the dimly lit room, thinking about how many chances they hadn't been given. Their mother Sarah was lying unconscious in a hospital. The father had vanished.
And these children had spent who knew how long navigating a world that hadn't once stopped to take care of them.
He couldn't fix everything. He knew that. But he also knew what he could do. And it started with being there.
The next morning, while the children still slept, Stephen made the first real decision of this new path. He called his legal team and asked what he would need to do to obtain temporary guardianship. He didn't want to overstep, but the idea of someone else stepping in, some system worker with a clipboard deciding these kids' fate, made his stomach twist.
If no one else had stepped up, then maybe he was meant to.
And just before hanging up, Stephen added one more thing. I want to cover the mother's hospital bills.
Every cent. He didn't say it for credit. He didn't plan to tell the children.
But somewhere deep inside, Stephen Carter, millionaire, executive, man of logic and control, had felt something he hadn't felt in years. Responsibility, and it had nothing to do with business. The days that followed were some of the most overwhelming in Stephen's entire life. Not because of boardroom tension or financial collapse, but because 3 children had turned his carefully controlled world completely upside down. Jacob, though mature beyond his years, was still a child carrying too much weight. He checked on his sisters constantly, helped them get dressed, even cut their food before eating his own. It was clear this boy had lived in survival mode for so long that it was all he knew. Lily and Sophia were sweet but timid, especially around strangers, and jumped at sudden noises. They stuck to each other like shadows, rarely letting go, and always looking for the closest exit. Stephen hired a live-in caregiver named Teresa, a retired pediatric nurse with a gentle demeanor and an endless reserve of patience. She didn't ask questions when she arrived, just smiled warmly at the children, and began folding laundry with Sophia while chatting softly, as if they had always lived there.
Stephen watched from the kitchen, amazed at how easily she made space feel less intimidating.
That night, the girls slept better, and Jacob, though still guarded, didn't insist on sleeping near the door with one eye open. Meanwhile, Stephen was battling a very different war in the background: paperwork, bureaucracy, and the skeptical eyes of a system that had no idea how to classify his involvement. His lawyers filed for temporary guardianship, and that triggered a long list of requirements: home visits, background checks, interviews with social workers, and evaluations from child psychologists.
Stephen didn't protest. He just did it.
He attended every meeting, answered every question, opened his apartment for every inspection, even rearranged the entire guest wing to function like a proper children's space. He bought bunk beds, educational toys, and a mountain of picture books. He sat through parenting seminars online late at night, scribbling notes like a student, trying to catch up on years he never planned for.
But not everyone believed he was sincere.
During one of the early home visits, a social worker named Ms. Garland, with sharp eyes and a clipboard always in hand, made her skepticism very clear. She looked around at the apartment, the staff, the pristine toys, and finally at Stephen himself, dressed in business casual and visibly tense. "Mr. Carter, I must be honest," she said while adjusting her glasses. "This setup is impressive, but fostering, especially with the possibility of long-term placement, is not something you can manage like a corporate acquisition." Stephen stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "I don't intend to manage these kids like assets.
I just intend to keep them together and safe."
She made a note without reacting and moved on.
That night, as he tucked Sophia into bed, she looked up at him and whispered, "Do we have to go back to the place with the green walls?" Stephen didn't understand at first.
But Jacob clarified later, the place with green walls was the foster intake center. That's where they'd first been taken when child services got involved. That was the place where Jacob overheard the plan to separate them. "No," Stephen said softly, crouching beside Sophia's bed.
"You're not going back there."
He couldn't promise the future, but he could promise that. Later, when all 3 children were asleep, Stephen sat in his office in the dark, reading through Sarah Miller's medical records. She remained unconscious, stable, but unresponsive, in the same ICU room. The hospital had told him there was no timetable for when or if she would wake, but he had already paid her medical bills in full, ensured she had the best neurologists in the state, and added private care services. Something about her, about this whole story, felt too close to let go.
He didn't just feel responsible for the kids. He felt tethered to their mother in a strange, unspoken way.
He remembered what the nurse had said when he asked how the accident happened. Sarah had been hit by a drunk driver on her way home from a night shift. She had been working 2 jobs, no family nearby, no help, just her and her kids. She had fought so hard to keep them together. Stephen knew this just by how fiercely Jacob clung to his role as protector. And the more Stephen learned, the more he began to wonder why he, a man who once refused to adopt a dog because it might disrupt his schedule, now felt like he could never let these 3 children go. By the end of the 3rd week, the apartment no longer felt like a hotel. It smelled like cinnamon toast and baby shampoo. Toys occasionally littered the floor. The hallway echoed with footsteps too small to be his. There were tantrums, laughter, bedtime stories read badly, but with love. It was chaos. And yet, for the first time in his life, Stephen Carter didn't dread walking through his own front door. And the biggest shift of all came one evening when Jacob sat beside him on the couch after dinner. He was quiet for a while, staring down at his lap. "Do you think our mom's going to wake up?" he asked, voice small and flat. Stephen didn't lie. "I hope she does. But I don't know." Jacob nodded slowly. "If she doesn't, can we still stay here together?" Stephen felt something twist in his chest. This was the question he knew would come, and he had already made his decision. "Yes," he said. "You'll stay together, and if it's okay with you, you'll stay with me." Jacob didn't respond with words. Instead, he leaned over and rested his head lightly on Stephen's shoulder. It was the first time he had let himself do that. Stephen didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stayed still, grateful, grounded, and deeply changed. Morning sunlight filtered gently through the tall windows of Stephen's apartment, casting a soft golden glow across the living room floor, where Lily and Sophia were already curled up with their stuffed animals, waiting for cartoons to begin. Jacob stood by the kitchen counter, helping Teresa pour cereal while keeping an eye on his sisters. It was becoming a routine, one built not out of luxury, but out of survival, slowly transformed into something that resembled family. Stephen stood nearby, sipping coffee and trying to believe that what he saw unfolding in front of him was real. For weeks now, the apartment had changed. His schedule had changed. He had changed. There was no more morning news in silence. No more rigid start to the day followed by boardrooms and international calls. Instead, there were small hands tugging at his sleeves asking about pancakes. There were missing socks, cereal spills, and giggles echoing through marble hallways that used to feel sterile. And even though the legal guardianship process was still in progress, Stephen felt the shift in himself long before the papers were signed. He no longer thought of the children as someone else's problem, or even as temporary guests. He thought of them as his, not by blood, not yet by law, but by choice. But despite the growing warmth, there were still moments that reminded him how deep the wounds were. That afternoon, while Stephen was in a video meeting with one of his regional directors, he heard a loud crash from the hallway, followed by Sophia's piercing cry. He bolted out of his seat, barely muttering an apology before ending the call. In the hallway, Sophia was on the floor, tangled in a mess of toys and tears. Jacob was already helping her up, apologizing over and over, his own eyes wide with panic. "I didn't see her. I didn't see her there," he kept repeating, voice shaking. "I should have watched better. I should have." Stephen crouched beside them, gently inspecting Sophia's knee, which was slightly scraped, but not serious. Still, her crying continued, and Jacob's panic only worsened. Stephen reached out and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Jacob," he said, calm but firm. "It was an accident. She's okay. You're not in trouble." But Jacob didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, his shoulders trembling. It wasn't about the fall. It was something deeper. Fear, guilt, maybe a flashback to the time before they ran. Stephen gently pulled him into a hug. And to his surprise, Jacob didn't resist. He clung to Stephen with a grip that felt desperate, like a boy waiting for everything to fall apart again. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, and the apartment had grown quiet, Stephen sat with Jacob in the kitchen. He made hot cocoa and slid a mug across the counter. "You did everything right today," Stephen said.
You took care of your sister. You were there for her. And you didn't do anything wrong. Jacob stared into his mug for a long time before answering. When Mom went into the hospital, nobody came for us right away. We stayed in the apartment for a few days eating cereal and crackers. Then people came, took us to that place. I tried to keep Lily and Sophia calm, but they were so scared. And they said we couldn't stay together. Stephen listened in silence, his chest tight. I thought I could fix it all, Jacob continued. If I just did everything right, if I stayed strong, but I couldn't stop it. They were going to separate us. So, I ran. Stephen leaned forward, his voice low and steady. Jacob, I don't want you to carry all of this by yourself anymore. You're allowed to be a kid. You don't have to protect everyone every second. But if I don't, who will? Jacob whispered. I will, Stephen answered. You're not alone anymore. Jacob didn't respond, but he didn't argue either. That was enough for now. The following day, Stephen met again with Ms. Garland from Child Services. This time she brought another specialist, a child psychologist named Dr. Heller, to observe the children. The evaluation was standard, part of the guardianship process, but it left Stephen tense all morning. He hated watching strangers write notes while Lily shyly hid behind a chair or while Jacob sat stiffly answering questions like he was being tested. Afterward, Dr. Heller approached Stephen privately. They're doing better than expected, she said. But they've clearly experienced trauma, especially Jacob. He's developed what we call a hyper-responsibility complex. It's common in children who step into parental roles too early. The good news is he's starting to let go. That only happens when a child begins to feel safe again. Stephen nodded slowly. So, I'm doing okay. Dr. Heller smiled. You're doing better than okay. Just keep showing up. That night, the kids asked Stephen to read them a bedtime story. He tried, tripping over silly voices and mispronouncing character names, but they laughed, especially Sophia, whose soft giggles finally filled the room without hesitation. When he turned off the light, Lily asked quietly, "Can we stay here forever?" Stephen swallowed the lump in his throat and answered, "As long as you want." Outside, the city lights glowed against the glass, reflecting a world of noise, ambition, and speed. But inside, in the soft dark of a child's bedroom, a man who had once measured his worth by wealth was slowly learning a new kind of value. One built not on profit, but presence. And somewhere in the quiet, Jacob finally slept through the night. On a gray Wednesday morning, just as spring threatened to give way to summer, Stephen received a call from Mount Grace Hospital that stopped his heart mid-beat. He had just dropped Lily and Sophia off at a music class and was returning to the office for a rare few hours of work when his phone buzzed. The caller ID read Mount Grace ICU. And for a moment, he was afraid to answer, but he did. The nurse's voice was calm, but carried the weight of something important. "Mr. Carter, I'm calling about Sarah Miller. She's showing signs of waking up." She opened her eyes briefly and responded to verbal prompts. "We've contacted the social worker, but we thought you should be informed directly." Stephen didn't ask questions. He simply turned the car around, canceled his meetings with one sentence in a group message, and drove straight to the hospital. On the way there, he kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other pressed to his chest, trying to breathe through the swirl of emotions rising inside him. She was waking up. The children's mother, the woman whose kids had transformed his life, was returning, and he didn't know what would come next. When he arrived at the hospital, he was taken up immediately by a nurse who recognized him. She led him to the same room where Jacob had stood weeks ago, whispering to an unconscious mother, promising he'd take care of his sisters. But now the room was different. The lights were brighter. Machines had been moved aside slightly. The beeping was less frequent, and Sarah Miller was awake. Her eyes fluttered open when he entered. She looked disoriented, her face pale and thin, but her expression sharpened when she noticed him. It was clear she didn't recognize him. Stephen approached slowly, unsure what to say. "Miller, Sarah, I'm Stephen Carter. I've been taking care of your children while you've been here." That name caught her attention. My children?
Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a breath.
They're safe, Stephen said quickly. They're with me. Jacob found me. He asked for help. They're okay. All three of them.
Her eyes welled up instantly and her fingers trembled as she tried to sit up.
They're together. Yes, he said. They never left each other. Jacob made sure of that.
He kept them safe until I found them. Sarah closed her eyes and tears slipped down her cheeks.
I thought they would be taken, separated. I couldn't stop it.
Stephen pulled a chair to her bedside. He explained everything, how Jacob had come to him, how they had lived on the street for a short time, how the system had tried to separate them, how he'd fought to keep them together.
He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize.
He just told her the truth piece by piece while she cried silently, her fingers curling in the blanket. When he mentioned that he'd filed for temporary guardianship, he paused, watching her carefully.
He didn't know how she would react. Would she be angry? Would she want to take them away from him immediately? But Sarah surprised him.
You kept them safe, she whispered.
You did what I couldn't. I'll never forget that. He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. She wasn't ready to see the children yet, the doctors explained. Her body was fragile and the emotional shock might be overwhelming, but they agreed to allow Stephen to bring the children in over the next few days in carefully timed visits. When Stephen returned home that night, he found Jacob helping Teresa fold towels and Sophia asleep on the couch with a book resting on her chest. He pulled Jacob aside gently. Your mom woke up. Jacob froze. What?
She's weak and she's still recovering, but she woke up.
She asked about you. All of you.
Tears immediately filled Jacob's eyes, and he sat down hard on the floor like the weight of hope had caught him off balance. Stephen crouched beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll go see her soon, but I want you to know something.
No matter what happens, I'm here. I'm not leaving. That night, Stephen couldn't sleep.
He walked the apartment like a ghost, checking on the children, sitting quietly in the kitchen, wondering what the next chapter would bring.
He'd never planned to be anyone's father.
And yet, with every passing day, it had become harder to imagine life without these three kids in it.
2 days later, they visited Sarah.
The hospital had arranged a private moment. When Jacob stepped into the room and saw her sitting up, frail but smiling, he burst into tears and ran to her.
Lily and Sophia clung to Stephen's legs at first, afraid, unsure.
But Sarah reached out with trembling hands, and they eventually climbed into the bed beside her. There were no grand speeches, no rehearsed reunions, just tears and touches and long silences. Sarah held all three children as if trying to make up for the time lost in sleep.
Stephen stood back, letting them have their moment.
But Sarah's eyes kept drifting toward him with gratitude so heavy it didn't need words. And for the first time, Stephen realized he wasn't just a guardian. He was part of something now. Something fragile, but real.
Something that could survive even this.
He didn't know how the future would unfold, but he knew one thing for certain.
Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone.
The transition from hospital room to real life was not instant. Sarah remained under medical observation for another 2 weeks, and during that time, she and Stephen fell into a strange rhythm, a quiet exchange of responsibility, honesty, and cautious connection. Stephen brought the children to visit her every other day, balancing the emotional intensity of those reunions with the need to keep the children grounded in their new routine.
Each visit was different.
Sometimes the kids were overjoyed, other times overwhelmed. Sarah would hug them, stroke their hair, cry softly, and apologize again and again, even though Jacob kept telling her it wasn't her fault.
Stephen noticed something else, too. Jacob had started to relax, not entirely, but noticeably.
He no longer flinched at unexpected noises or insisted on sleeping near the door.
He smiled more.
His posture had changed. He let go of control more easily. He allowed himself to be cared for. And every time he turned to Stephen with a question or asked for help with something simple, Stephen felt a quiet swell of something that had grown slowly and deeply, love, not just for the boy, but for all three of them. Meanwhile, Sarah and Stephen had begun talking not just about the children or logistics, but about life before the coma, before everything had gone wrong. Sarah spoke about how she had worked nights as a medical assistant and studied during the day, how hard it had been to raise 3 children with no support system. She admitted that the girls' father had been unstable and had left them just before the accident. She said she had fought to hold everything together for as long as she could until her body gave out in that one terrifying moment on the road. Stephen listened without judgment. He never offered pity. He only listened. And when he did speak, it was with quiet respect. He shared pieces of himself, too. His childhood with distant parents. The way he had chased success to escape emptiness. How for years he believed he wasn't meant to have a family because he didn't think he'd know what to do with one. But now everything had changed. The apartment wasn't a showroom anymore. It was a home. There were drawings on the fridge, mismatched socks in the laundry, and snack crumbs in the corners of the couch cushions. Teresa had become part of the family, too, not as a nanny, but as a gentle, constant presence who always knew when someone needed a hug or a sandwich or just silence. The entire space had transformed to accommodate love, and Stephen often found himself stopping in the middle of the day just to watch the children play, as if reminding himself that this wasn't a dream. Then came the conversation he had both expected and feared. Sarah had been discharged from the hospital and was staying in a rehab facility temporarily, recovering her strength. One afternoon, while Stephen was helping Jacob with homework and the girls were coloring nearby, she called him and asked to meet. They sat in a small park near the facility beneath a tree that offered more shade than comfort. "I've been thinking a lot," Sarah said, her hands folded tightly in her lap, "about what's best for them, about what I can handle." Stephen waited, not wanting to interrupt her. "I love them more than anything. But I'm not ready to take them back full time. Not yet. I can barely walk up a flight of stairs without help. I can't be what they need right now. And if I try too soon, I might end up failing them again." Stephen felt a mix of relief and sadness, but most of all, respect. It was the hardest kind of love to admit you couldn't be everything in that moment. "I don't want to disappear," Sarah continued. "I want to be their mother. I want to heal. I want to work again, maybe even finish school. I want to be strong again for them. But I can't do that if I'm pretending I'm already okay." She looked him in the eyes. "Would you consider continuing to care for them? Not just temporarily, but long-term, with me still in their lives as something shared?" Stephen didn't need time to think. He nodded and said, "Yes, absolutely." They sat for a while in silence after that. Two adults, both broken in different ways, choosing to build something new out of what had once been disaster. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because something real had grown between all of them. Back at home, when Stephen told the children that their mother would be staying nearby and that they'd still be living with him, Jacob simply smiled and said, "I knew she wouldn't leave us, and I knew you wouldn't either." And for the first time, Stephen realized that the man he used to be, the one obsessed with perfection, power, and prestige, had slowly disappeared. In his place stood someone softer, stronger, and more complete. Someone who hadn't just saved 3 children, but had been saved by them, too. Summer arrived slowly, and with it came a peace Stephen hadn't felt in years. The days were warmer, longer, and filled with the kind of moments that had once seemed foreign to him. Early morning cartoons with messy cereal bowls, chalk drawings on the balcony, squeals of laughter in the hallway, and long, sticky afternoons at the park. But even in this newfound rhythm, Stephen remained grounded in the reality that everything he had now came from the most unexpected place. Every bedtime story, every coloring page, every little hug from Sophia or quiet nod from Jacob was a reminder that just months ago they were strangers and now they were everything. Jacob was blossoming. He had finally joined a local school summer program. And although he still had moments of hesitation, he had begun making friends. He would come home talking about science projects and soccer games, his voice filled with the excitement of a child who finally felt safe enough to just be a child. Lily and Sophia had started calling Stephen Dad by accident at first. Quick slips that caught even them off guard, but after a while, it became natural. The first time Sophia said it out loud on purpose, Stephen had to turn away for a second just to blink back the tears.
Sarah visited often.
She was still recovering, still in physical therapy and attending counseling, but she had regained her spark. The first few visits were quiet, emotional. She would sit with the children under the big maple tree in the backyard while Stephen stayed nearby, giving them space, but always watching. Over time, she began staying longer, sometimes joining them for dinner or sitting in on story time. There was no tension between her and Stephen. In fact, there was a kind of quiet partnership, a shared understanding that they were both doing the best they could and that neither of them had to carry it alone anymore.
One afternoon in July, the entire household took a trip to the zoo.
It had been Lily's idea, scribbled in crayon on a piece of paper labeled Family Adventure List. Stephen rented a van, packed sandwiches, and even remembered sunscreen, which amazed Teresa.
Sarah joined them, too, walking with a cane, but keeping up. The children ran from exhibit to exhibit, faces lit with wonder, while Stephen and Sarah followed from behind, sometimes talking, sometimes just smiling at the sight of their kids finally being allowed to be kids. At one point while the children fed goats at the petting zoo, Sarah turned to Stephen and said, "They're happy, aren't they?" He looked at them and nodded. "They really are." And she added, "I never thought they'd smile like that again. I thought I'd ruin them." Stephen didn't answer with words. He just gently squeezed her hand, and she didn't pull away. Later that night, after the children had all collapsed into bed, sunburned and exhausted, Stephen sat on the back porch with Sarah. The stars were faint through the city haze. But the evening was still. She sipped tea slowly, her eyes following the flicker of a firefly in the distance. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "About what happens next. About where I belong." Stephen waited, knowing she needed to say this in her own time. "I want to find a small place nearby. Something manageable, close enough to visit whenever I want, but with enough space for them to stay overnight sometimes. I don't want to confuse them. I don't want to take them from what's become their home. But I also want them to know I'm here, that I'll always be here." Stephen nodded, his voice quiet. "You already are. They know that." They sat in silence for a while. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with meaning. There was no bitterness, no rivalry, no confusion about roles. Just mutual respect and something deeper that neither of them had expected when their lives first collided. Not quite love in the romantic sense, but something perhaps more profound, trust rooted in survival and chosen over time. Inside, Jacob stirred in his sleep and called out. Stephen moved without hesitation, stepping through the door and disappearing into the hallway to soothe him. Sarah watched him go, her eyes soft, her heart full, and for the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, she felt like the future might hold more hope than fear. That night, as Stephen sat by Jacob's bed, gently rubbing his back until he fell asleep again, he realized something else. The family he had now wasn't one he had inherited or purchased or planned for. It was one he had grown into through pain, through patience, through countless moments where love had been chosen in place of comfort. And though the world still saw him as a millionaire CEO, in this quiet, messy, beautiful corner of life, he had become something else entirely. A father, a partner in healing, and a man who had found purpose not in profits, but in people he never expected to call his own. By the end of August, life had settled into something that felt both ordinary and extraordinary all at once. The apartment, once a minimalist bachelor's sanctuary, now had fingerprints on the glass doors, forgotten toys under the coffee table, and the hum of cartoon-themed songs floating from the living room. There were sticky notes with crayon drawings stuck to the fridge. There were shoes piled by the door in various sizes. There was laughter during dinner and the occasional sibling squabble over who got the blue bowl. What had once been a space built for success now existed for love, for family, for chaos, and Stephen wouldn't have had it any other way. School was starting soon, and preparations had taken over the household. Jacob was entering second grade, Lily was starting kindergarten, and Sophia would spend her days in an early childhood learning program at a local center. Stephen, who once considered school runs a foreign concept, now knew every item on their supply lists by heart. He took pride in labeling notebooks, organizing backpacks, and letting the girls pick their favorite lunchboxes, even when they chose ones that glittered. One evening, the family sat around the dining table, which had grown too small for comfort, but perfect for closeness.
Sarah had joined them for dinner, as she did more frequently now, and the kids were recounting their expectations for the first day of school with equal parts excitement and dread. Lily wanted to wear her pink dress. Jacob insisted on carrying his new science book, and Sophia only cared that her lunch had animal-shaped cookies. After the kids went to bed, Sarah and Stephen stood in the kitchen cleaning up. She rinsed dishes while he dried them. The routine so familiar now that it no longer required words. But Sarah broke the silence. "I put in the application," she said, her voice calm. Stephen paused, setting down the plate in his hand. "For the apartment?" She nodded. "Just a few blocks away. Small, bright, big enough for the kids to visit. Close enough that I can still be here for the big things and the small ones." He smiled gently. "You don't need to explain. You've done more than enough to earn your space. I'm glad you're staying close." There was a pause, not tense, just full. "I never imagined it would turn out this way," she admitted. "That the man my son ran to on the street would become, well, what you've become to us." Stephen looked at her, his expression steady and sincere. "I didn't imagine it either, but I wouldn't trade it." The following week was a whirlwind of firsts. First day of school photos on the balcony. First time Jacob walked his sisters to the classroom door, proud and protective. First school bus ride. First after-school snack waiting on the table when they returned. Stephen had arranged his schedule so he could be there for every moment. Investors and board members had learned to wait. The company ran smoothly under his leadership, but he no longer let it consume him. For the first time, balance didn't feel like compromise. It felt like victory. In early September, a hearing was scheduled at the courthouse to finalize the guardianship arrangement. Though Sarah retained her legal rights as a parent and intended to remain a permanent part of the children's lives, she wanted Stephen's role made official. It was a formal way of acknowledging what everyone already knew. This family wasn't temporary. It was real, rooted in love and effort. The courtroom was quiet, filled only with the necessary staff, Sarah, Stephen, and the three children seated together on a bench that was too tall for their legs to reach the floor. The judge, a woman with kind eyes and a stern voice, reviewed the documents slowly, then looked at the group. "Are the children happy?" she asked Jacob. He looked at Stephen, then back at the judge. "We are now. And you, Mr. Carter, do you understand the responsibility this carries? This is not a temporary commitment. This is a promise to raise, protect, and guide these children legally, emotionally, and in every way that matters." Stephen nodded without hesitation. "I understand, and I choose it." The judge signed the papers. The stamp echoed across the room. It was done. When they returned home that evening, the children ran through the apartment like they were lighter, somehow, like something unspoken had been lifted. Sarah stayed for dinner again, but this time she brought a housewarming gift for Stephen, a framed drawing made by the kids, showing all of them holding hands under a sky with three suns. She laughed when she explained. "They said it's because they wanted it to always be warm." Stephen hung it above the couch, replacing a piece of modern art he no longer cared about. That night, after everyone had gone to bed and the apartment was quiet, Stephen stepped out onto the balcony and looked out over the city. The light sparkled below, a reminder of the life he once thought he wanted, the endless pursuit of power, wealth, and control. But now, standing barefoot with the sound of soft breathing from the children's rooms behind him, he realized that everything truly important had come from letting go of all that. Family had come not through blood, but through choice, through pain and persistence and kindness, through small hands reaching out and a broken heart willing to open. And in the end, the greatest success he would ever know wasn't a number on a screen or a title on a door. It was being the person they came home to. It was being loved. It was being needed. And most of all, it was being theirs. The ending of this story speaks to something quietly powerful. The idea that love isn't always something we're born into, but something we choose, nurture, and grow into. What began as an act of unexpected kindness turned into a lifelong bond forged through trust, resilience, and healing. Stephen's transformation from a detached, high-powered executive into a devoted father figure shows that sometimes the most meaningful success isn't found in boardrooms, but in bedtime stories, scraped knees, and second chances.
This ending is hopeful without being unrealistic.
It honors the pain and struggle these characters endured, but doesn't let that pain define them.
It gives space for the messiness of real love.
Imperfect, complicated, but fiercely enduring.
And that, to me, is the most honest kind of happy ending. Fade out with Millionaire in love logo and music.